student subgroup sizes for accountability. I'm Heather Hough of PACE, and I'm the Executive Director of the Core PACE Research Partnership. And I'm here with Joe Witte, who is an analyst here at PACE that worked on the analysis that we'll be discussing today, and also Noah Bookman, who's the Chief Accountability Officer for the core districts. So just a couple of logistical notes. This is a GoToWebinar, and for those of you that haven't been on a GoToWebinar before, the way to engage with us, there are two ways to ask questions. One is that you can raise your hand in the box where your name is listed. The second is that you can chat any comments to us or to the group in the chat box. So please, if you have clarifying questions, interject those throughout. We're happy to have it be more of a conversation than a direct presentation. But we also will have an opportunity for a more extended conversation and question and answer period at the end. Next slide, please, Noah. And just in honor of today's, to celebrate yesterday, thank you all for joining us the day after a long holiday weekend. I know that can be a little bit rough, so we even more than usual appreciate your joining us. And we feel like it's a particularly fitting opportunity for us to discuss the implications for subgroup size under the Every Student Succeeds Act. What's more American than that? So today we will be talking first, Noah will talk about CORE's accountability framework in depth and how the subgroup size came into play in their decision-making process. And then I will go into our analysis about subgroup sizes. And for those of you that have looked at the policy memo, we actually did some supplemental analyses comparing a subgroup size of 20 to a subgroup size of 30. So you'll get a bonus analysis on this call that wasn't in the original policy memo. So with that, go ahead, Noah.
Great. Thanks so much, Heather. Good morning, everybody. Noah Bookman from the core districts. It's a great group on the call this morning. So I'm going to just spend about 10 minutes talking to you all about the core districts and our approach to measuring school quality improvement and why we landed on an N size of 20 and how we've used that in our system so far. As many of you know, CORE is a collaborative of 9 districts across the state of California. We've got a cluster of districts down in Southern California that include Los Angeles, Garden Grove, Santa Ana, and Long Beach. Sanger and Fresno are up here in the Central Valley, and then Oakland and San Francisco, and our colleagues up in Sacramento City. Together, those districts serve almost or over 1 million kids every day, and important to this call is our focus on all students in our districts and the fact that core districts disproportionately serve youth in poverty, English learners, and other high needs groups in the state of California. We designed and developed our school quality improvement system under the auspices of our No Child Left Behind waiver. And I think what you're going to notice is a lot of the principles behind our school quality improvement system are the same as what are behind the LCFF and the LCAPs, as well as the Every Student Succeeds Act. We wanted to move away from a narrow focus on just academic indicators to looking at our academic measures in the context of other things like social, emotional, and culture climate factors. We wanted to look at accountability not so much as a hammer, but more as a flashlight, so that we could use our measures as strength and needs assessments. I think that's not actually a light point when it comes to today's topic around N size. You know, the retreat to an N size of 100 had a lot to do with the fact that NCLB treated any subgroup that was underperforming as calling a school as failing, and I think that indeed felt very much like a hammer. And so that retreat to an N size of 100, which meant that a lot of subgroups were hidden, which Heather's analysis and Joe's will show, had a lot to do with this. What was the purpose of accountability? In our minds, when the purpose of accountability is a flashlight, then it makes a lot more sense to lower that N size and to make more students visible. We are also moving away from just achievement to achievement and growth, and as we see at the bottom here, to making more kids visible through N size of 20. The measures in our system are up here on the screen. I think many of the folks on the call have seen these before. Important to know that this was developed in collaboration with core district staff and leaders and with other folks in the districts. We had these guiding principles, which I talked about before, and we've had input from a lot of the folks on the phone and a lot of people throughout the state and nation around what's going to make for the highest quality information about schools. We include indicators of academic in the academic domain, like achievement on tests and growth, as well as grad rates. And then we look at this issue of what percentage of middle schoolers are leaving their middle school, high school ready. It has to do with looking at kids who are have at least a 2.5 GPA, a 96% attendance rate, no D's or F's in their main English and math classes, and not having to suspend in 8th grade. And those kids are 90 to 95% likely to graduate on time. And then we have these indicators on the social, emotional, culture, climate side, like chronic absenteeism, culture, climate surveys of student, staff, and parent suspensions, social, emotional skills, and EL redesignation. And what's important in looking at all these measures is that we look at subgroups in addition to the all students group. And when we reduced the N size to 20, we found that about 150,000 more kids were counted in a subgroup. And Heather and Joe's analysis really bring this to life in terms of the trade-offs there. Each of the measures was carefully looked at in terms of evidence of being measurable. That is, they have good measurement, quality, validity, reliability, stability, actionable. Do we have good evidence that schools can actually move this thing, and meaningful? Do we have good evidence that this relates to what we ultimately care about in terms of college career readiness? This last year, we released for the first time our School Quality Improvement Index. Most of the measures were in there. Growth and culture, climate surveys and social emotional skills are coming in the next round. You'll notice that there are weights up here on the screen, and that's because we do index these things. Ultimately, we give them a weight, and schools get a score out of 100. It's less important than the measure-by-measure results, but it is a part of what we do. And these are the weights that we're using going into next year. What you'll generally see with these weights is that we evenly weight each of the measures within a particular category. So 60% to academics, 40% to the social, emotional, culture, climate factors. You'll notice the even weighting 8% throughout these, and 20% or 30% on these measures. And the reason I raise that is because the next thing we do is that we generally then, and this gets to the subgroup question, we generally then evenly weight subgroup performance. So for instance, if you're looking at elementary accountability and ELA is worth 30% this year, 15% of that result went to the subgroups and 15% went to the all students group. And we evenly divided that into 4 categories of subgroups. We look at your English learners, socioeconomically disadvantaged youth, students with disabilities, and then we look at all the racial ethnic subgroups, but the one that shows up on your index is whatever the lowest performing one is. And that was our way of looking at subgroups, which allows us to look at each of the subgroup categories separately. And this lowering of the N size to 20 means that we have a lot more subgroups in play getting showtime on our reports. So this is an example of the front page of our reports that looks at just the all students results. But what I really wanted to highlight is then when we look at our subgroups, what we do is we then look at, for any given metric, how did the all students group do, and then how did each of these subgroup categories do to identify strengths and challenge areas. And this coloring that you're seeing, the red, yellow, green, or red, orange, green, is tied to a set of performance thresholds that are the same thresholds for the all students group as well as each of the subgroups. And so you're able to really see where those strengths and challenge areas are. So that gives you a sense of kind of how we in CORE thought about measuring school quality and why we put such an emphasis on subgroup performance. And any of these subgroup results that you're seeing, on our choice was to include any subgroup with 20 or more students. We traded off a little bit of the precision you get for higher N sizes for making more youth visible, which is the other end of this coin. So with that, I will turn it back to Heather. And I think now, Heather, I meant to make you presenter, yes?
I do not have the presenter ball yet.
Great, it's coming.
Great.
All right.
Okay, great. Thanks, Noah. So now that you know a bit about CORE's model, I want to step back and couch this in a broader policy conversation underway about the implementation of ESSA. So for those of you that are familiar and are watching policy, ESSA requires a specific set of measures that are more comprehensive than what most states have been measuring, that very closely aligns with some of the work that CORE has already begun doing. And so a lot of the analyses that we're involved in right now with CORE are helping to shed some light on the federal conversation. And the subgroup size piece is one of those elements. So while we won't be going much here into the different kinds of measures that CORE has created and the relationship to ESSA, I think it's worth pointing out that under ESSA, the elementary and middle schools will be required to, or states on behalf of the schools will be required to measure annual academic achievement, academic growth, or another academic measure, English proficiency, and this non-academic measure, sometimes referred to as the fifth indicator, which can be a measure of student engagement, educator engagement, student access to and completion of advanced coursework, post-secondary readiness, or school climate and safety. At the high school level, they'll be required to measure annual academic achievement, graduation rate, English proficiency, and again, this non-academic measure. Also under ESSA, it specifically calls out that schools have to measure their subgroups. And the specific groups that they call out are each major racial ethnic group, economically disadvantaged students, students with disabilities, and students by EL status. And you'll see from the work that Noah just presented that these correspond quite nicely with the subgroups that CORE has been measuring now for a couple of years. Now, under ESSA, subgroup size initially was quite vague. It specified that the federal regulations would provide some guidance as to what the subgroup size should be, but that it had to have a really research-based rationale. In the time since ESSA came out and the regs, we published our PACE core brief, which compared 20 to 100, and it influenced the development of the regulations. Actually, we were only one of 4 reports that was referenced in the regs, specifying that now states are allowed to establish a range of N sizes, but that cannot exceed 30. So in response to that, what we did is a reanalysis to look now at the difference between 20 and 30. Since the federal regulations now state that states can't go above 30, what we wanted to do was explore what the difference between 20 and 30 is. So we'll still be discussing the large gap between 20 and 100, but we're going to focus a little bit more tightly on the difference between 20 and 30. Because that's where the federal conversation is, and that's perhaps a conversation that we can influence in Sacramento as well. So to get started, one of the first questions that we wanted to ask is how many students are included and how many schools have visible subgroups at different size specifications. So what you see in front of you here is the percent of students that are reported by subgroup threshold. Now the way to look at this table is that for each of these subgroups, it shows the percent of students that are visible when the subgroup size is greater than 100, that's this blue bar, the percent of students that are visible when the subgroup is 30 to 100, and then the percent of students that are visible at 20 to 30. And then these are students that are not visible in schools because there are less than 20 of them in the schools. So what's important to point out here is that at a subgroup size of 100, only about 37% of African American students are made visible. When you decrease that to 20%, 88% of students are visible. And so in the initial report that we put out, this is a very stark difference. Similarly, we call attention to the students with disabilities, where 25% of the students are visible at a subgroup size of greater than 100, and that number jumps up to 92% when the subgroup size is 20. Now what we want to highlight in this secondary analysis that we did is that while the difference between 20 and 30 is not as stark as the difference between 100 and 20, it's still a very sizable chunk. And so these circles that you see here are what happens when we move the subgroup size from 20 to 30, or from 30 down to 20. So at an N size of 30, 81% of African American students are counted, and when we decrease that to 20, 88% are counted. Similarly, with students with disabilities, 79% of students are counted at an N size of 30. When we reduce that to 20, 92% of students are now counted. So this is nothing to sneeze at. This is still a pretty substantial difference. But it becomes even more important when we look at this by school. So what you're looking at here is the percent of schools that report students in different subgroups by the subgroup threshold. Again, a similar way to look at it is that the blue bar represents an N size of greater than 100, we have 30 to 100 in the red, and then 20 to 30 in the yellow. And this is schools now that are reporting subgroups, percent of schools. And what we see here is that in the African American subgroup, again, only 7% of schools report African American students when the N size is 100. And when we reduce that to 20, now 41% of schools report. We have a similarly large or even larger effect when we look at students with disabilities, where we go up to 73% from, it looks like about 10% here, students with disabilities, which is an incredible change and something that we highlighted in the initial report. But again, we wanted to take a look at the difference between 20 and 30. And what we see here is that when we reduce that, when the N size is 30, 32% of schools report African American students. But when we decrease that to 20, 41% now report. That's 29% more schools that now are reporting African American students from moving the subgroup size from 30 to 20. Similarly, or even larger effect with the students with disabilities, 52% of schools are reporting student with disabilities subgroups at an N size of 30, but when we reduce that to 20, that jumps up to 73%, which is 39% more schools. So when we think about what ESSA requires, and that ESSA requires subgroup reporting for each of these subgroups, 39% more schools reporting students with disabilities is a pretty substantial increase. We wanted to be able to show you what this looks like when we look over continuous student subgroup thresholds. So that's what you're seeing here on the screen. So the way to look at that is that at a subgroup size of 0, obviously 100% of schools would be reporting their subgroups because you would report even one student. And what this shows is that as you increase the student subgroup size, the number of schools reporting drops off. And you can see here at 100, it's very much lower. But what it shows you here is that between 20 and 30, there's still a pretty substantial drop-off, and this is the student subgroup size threshold. 73% of schools report the students at a subgroup size of 20. This drops down to 52% at a subgroup size of 30. Another important thing to know about this is that the drop-off is pretty large at every 1 unit increase here in this part of the slope. For instance, between 20 and 50 subgroup size, we can expect a 1.86% decrease in the percentage of schools meeting that threshold for inclusion with every 1 student increase in the subgroup size threshold. So the next thing that we wanted to look at was, if we've looked now at the number of schools that are reporting each individual subgroup, we want to get a comprehensive view of schools, how many subgroups each school is reporting at the different subgroup sizes. And so what you're looking at here is the percentage of schools at each of the different subgroup size levels that is reporting 0 subgroups, 1 subgroup, 2 subgroups, 3 subgroups, or 4 subgroups. And what we find is that at the subgroup size of 20, we have way more schools that are presenting all of the subgroups than at the lower size. So what we see here is that 69% of the schools, when the subgroup size is 20, are reporting all 4 subgroups. But this number decreases to only 50% of schools reporting all 4 subgroups when the subgroup size is 30 plus. And at a subgroup size of 100 plus, we only show 7 schools reporting all 4 of those subgroups. So again, in our initial report, what we pointed out was the vast difference between 20 and 100, which is quite large, 69% showing all subgroups versus 7. But again, this difference, 69% versus 50 for between 20 and 30 subgroup size, is pretty substantial and something that we should think about in terms of reporting. The next thing that we wanted to look at was this element that Noah discussed briefly, which is the lowest performing racial ethnic group. So I'll restate what the way that CORE deals with this. Which is that the core metrics on each individual metric, they specify the lowest performing racial group, which that is then included in the accountability metrics. So they measure all of the subgroups, but then the lowest performing racial ethnic group is reported individually for accountability purposes. And what we wanted to see was how this group changed when we had different subgroup sizes. So what you can see here is that when we moved from 20 to 100, we had a vastly different lowest performing racial ethnic groups that were made visible. So in this case, what you see here is that when we moved from 20 to 100, about 53% of the schools had the same lowest performing racial ethnic group. And then the additional 47% was about 26% where the LPRG was different. So they had a lowest performing racial ethnic group, but it changed. And then what this red indicates is that there was no lowest performing racial ethnic group when we moved from a subgroup size of 20 to a subgroup size of 100. And what we found in our initial analyses are that these students are, the most affected students are the African American students. At a subgroup size of 20 plus, 333 schools report African American students as their lowest performing racial ethnic group. But at a subgroup size of 100, the number drops to 70. And so what we highlighted in the report is that the students that are not being counted are often the students that are the most vulnerable, that are the most in need of being counted for both accountability and continuous improvement purposes. Now what we see when we compare 20 versus 30 is that we don't have as many schools that don't have a lowest performing racial ethnic group. So most schools are reporting at least one racial ethnic subgroup. But we still have 25% of the schools where the lowest performing racial ethnic group is different. And again, this is most frequently the African American student subgroup. And so these students are not being counted as often when we look at a subgroup size of 30 versus a subgroup size of 20. But they are an important group to study because when they are measured, they tend to be the lowest performing. Now just one other note that we wanted to put forward for you, because this is something that we're interested in informing the policy conversation, but also that's important for thinking about what accountability, the different purposes that an accountability measurement system can serve. One of those purposes is reporting, is identifying the bottom 5% of schools. And so what we show here is the math results when we compare a 100 plus threshold to a 20 plus threshold. And what we found is that while there is scattering, these are not identical, what we found is that the different measures do not differently identify the bottom 5% of schools. And the reason for this that shows up in our data is that these schools are just very consistently low performing. And so different ways of calculating subgroup sizes. And this again is with CORE's SQUE weights, which weight each of the subgroups and the all students in equal parts. But what we found is that in schools that have very low performance, it doesn't matter if you have a 20 or a 100 plus threshold because all of the students in those schools are quite underperforming. For example, at this minimal performance level, only 6% of students are meeting standards, both at the 20 plus and the 100 plus threshold. So that's it for our analysis, but we want to open it up for questions to you all. This can include clarifying questions, suggestions for future research and analysis, or from where you sit, we have an incredible group of people on the phone here or on the webinar. What are some implications in your work, and how should we think about this as a community moving forward? Now again, you can raise your hand or you can type your questions into the box.
We did have one clarifying question, and I think I know the answer to this, Heather. Tim Morrison was asking about when you said that ESSA allows states to establish a range of N sizes, does that mean the states can have different N sizes for different subgroups? I think the answer is no. I think you have to have the same N size for all of your subgroups, to my knowledge, although states have a lot of ability to propose different things. I think the idea here is that the law doesn't necessarily specify what the N size needs to be for state A versus state B, and there's some choice in that, although USSA is definitely trying to push people towards 30. What's your understanding of that piece?
That's true, but there is a little bit more nuance than that. So it is, the states for the most part have to have the same N size for these 4 student groups that they report on at the school level. And that can vary by state. But it's interesting, in the regs they say states can have any range of N sizes that they want within a state under 30. And that if they go above 30, then they really have to make a case for why they did that. And so, you know, it doesn't take a mathematician to see that there aren't that many numbers under 30 that would be viable for reporting purposes. But there are other subgroups that ESSA calls out that have to be reported at the state level, that can be reported at the school level. So this includes migrant students, foster youth, student gender. And at those, ESSA provides some flexibility for the N size that can be used. So one of the things that's come up in the regs and in conversation around the regs is that a state might not have a sizable proportion of foster youth, for example. And so an N size of 15 on that might be more appropriate than an N size of 30, just to make sure that those students are appropriately tracked and that services are appropriately provided. One other question here that came up in the panel is, how has CORE thought about balancing student privacy with reporting subgroups? Noah, could you speak to that?
Yeah, so we use that N size of 20 both for you know, what gets reported, as well as for you know, what gets included in accountability. And 20 is actually a very conservative N size for what gets reported. There are some concerns that folks have if you start getting really low in your N size for reporting, like say down to 5 or 4, 3 students or what have you, that it starts to become really obvious if you're looking at a particular school in a particular year and they only have 5 African-American kids, and then you report the results of the African-American kids and you see that their results, they're all not being standards. It's like, well, we know who those kids are. And so that's where, you know, 20 is a very conservative number, and we've stuck with that there. It's worth noting that in our state, for instance, they report results with 10 or more kids in the denominator, so 10 or more kids in the group, but only the 100 historically for NCLB purposes is what counted for accountability. So 10 is actually the more is probably the threshold that most stick at and try not to go under when it comes to public reporting.
Great, thanks, Noah. Okay, another question that's come up here is about the concern around using small subgroup size with some of the things that have been brought up around inconsistency around years. That when you have a smaller subgroup size, these might bounce around a little from year to year from within the same school. Noah, do you want to speak to that, how CORE has thought about that kind of variation across time?
Well, one of the things, we did definitely test the question of how stable are the metrics across time at the all students level. That was really important to us. So when we were looking, for instance, at chronic absenteeism or some of these other indicators, we tried to be pretty careful about making sure that there was a reasonable relationship between this year's results and last year's results. And it's actually one of the reasons why when we worked, and I think it's still a work in progress on, for instance, measuring redesignation rates at a school, that if you look at the way the state's historically done it, you find this thing where like the reclassification rates bounce all around because of when kids are coming in and out in terms of years. And so we try to adjust to a version where things were more stable over time. Now, at the subgroup level, what is definitely true is that in any result, the lower the N size, the lower the denominator, the more likely it is that, that you're going to get wider swings in year-over-year results. So this lowering of N size has trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs is you do get results that are a little bit less stable over time. And I'm sure if we showed a scatter plot that was N size versus year-over-year change, we would see that the lower the N size, the greater the year-over-year change. And so that's why this is a trade-off. On the one hand, we see the noteworthy data that suggests that if we don't go down lower in N size, we're going to leave a lot of kids off the playing field, as Mike Hansen and Fresno likes to say. But if we increase the N size, we're going to be more precise and stable in our results. So these are trade-offs.
I'll add to that too, Noah, that I think Noah's point about this measurement system being for continuous improvement and designed to use data as a flashlight and not a hammer is particularly important here, because if you think about how the numbers might jump over time, that makes sense when you're thinking about real students in real schools, that what we're actually trying to do is not to create a metric that is static over time when it's being used for continuous improvement, but rather that you want to be able to see as a system leader, how is this school doing with their subgroup students that they have in their school at this point in time. So if you have a group of students that came in kindergarten and is not being well served, or that a group of 5th grade students that was not doing well left the school and so the achievement looks higher, that's real variation. And so thinking about these measures for continuous improvement, where that kind of variation is important to observe, versus for accountability or for research, where your definition of validity and reliability might be that you want those to be stable across time. And I just think that's a really important thing to point out, that that kind of variation is useful.
Yeah, and I think it relates to, it's a really good point, Heather, and it relates to Carla, I'm gonna butcher the middle name, Pleitz's Howell was asking or pointing out, how do you think this research can be used to guide California's new accountability system and the work of the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence? And I think the question for the state is really one of, like, what's the purpose of the accountability system? What's the underlying thrust? And if the underlying thrust is focus on continuous improvement and a focus on making more kids visible and on strengths and challenges, then the state might want to be willing, as we have to date with CORE, to trade off some precision for making these things more visible. So that, for instance, as you're saying, I'm looking at my chronic absence results for all of my students, and now I really want to understand what's happening with my subgroups. My all students results pretty stable over year. My subgroups maybe not, because those are actual real kids. And this is actually telling me the true story, the real story of what's happening with a particular subgroup in a particular year. And that then relates to the work of the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, which is in early communications is really focused on continuous improvement, cycles of improvement. And when you do that kind of work, it's actually, and we've done this in CORE, it's really advantageous to get to a grain size of subgroups that is actionable, and to understand then what's happening with those kids so you can try something. So I think it speaks to the need to attend to these subgroups, large and small, in that kind of work.
Absolutely, and I'll add to that I think the numbers that we pointed out, looking at 20 versus 30 in the slides below, are really for us now, and by us I mean as a community of policymakers and advocates. It's now the time to say what we think is appropriate. So what the data show us is that there is still a sizable difference between a subgroup size of 20 and a subgroup size of 30. And so it's a value judgment at this point. Is there something that, is there enough momentum around 30 or enough rationale to keep the N size at 30 that we're comfortable with the trade-off in the percentage of students or the percentage of schools that are made visible? Or do we want to open up the conversation in Sacramento and statewide to talking about moving that to a subgroup size of 20?
And the last thing I'll say here is I think underlying this, the sort of the theme here is these things like the subgroup size, the way that metrics are looked at, how you identify schools that are going to be identified for intervention, and what kinds of interventions are part of the sort of solution or improvement process. There are all ways for policymakers to communicate a message about what they believe is important. And so that's, they're not small technical issues to be solved in a technical group. They are policy issues to be discussed in terms of the kinds of trade-offs that we're trying to raise here in this conversation.
Absolutely, that's a great point, Noah. Do we have any other questions, comments, or suggestions for us to move forward, or for this group of folks on the phone, ways to think about making use of this research moving forward? Okay. Thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate your time today after the long weekend to talk with us about our findings. We will be sending out in the next couple of days a follow-up to this email that provides the handouts, and also we're going to put this analysis that we pulled together for you all into a supplementary memo to that first brief, so that you can circulate or share the differences between a subgroup size of 20 and a subgroup size of 30. Because I think that's, at this point, that's where the conversation is. And again, I'd like to thank Joe Witte, who was a co-author on this report, the core districts for working with us and being such great partners, PACE and the PACE staff, Daisy Gonzalez, who's on the line here with us today and organized this call. And really appreciate all of you who signed in today, including some of our funders who, of course, this work would not be possible without you. So thank you so much. And of course, always, if you have follow-up questions or any information that you think would be useful in your work moving forward, please do not hesitate to email me or Noah, and we'll see what we can do. Noah, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
Nope. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.